resume the recording, and let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to ASHTO's Council on Public Transportation and MTAP 2020 virtual winter meeting. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is the last session of the winter meeting. So thank you for joining us again. Just to go through a few housekeeping items, I think you're expecting this next slide. Boom. Please, let's do a virtual roll call. Send us a chat with your name, your title, your agency, and your state if it's not obvious, and let us know who's online with us. And again, I do that not just for the benefit of keeping it as a record, but also for the benefit of the panelists, so they see who is online. And if there's questions, they know where the question is coming from. Also, please keep your self muted until it's question and answer time. Also, please keep your camera off. So Zoom is a little picky that way. It likes to crash on me every once in a while. So I find that the more cameras that are off, the less bandwidth I'm using. So please do all that. And lastly, please also, in addition to sending us a virtual roll call chat, send us all your questions, or send questions, send comments using the chat. Also, you're in charge of your own mic. So when it comes to question and answer time, please feel free to open your mic, especially if you have a long question. It's just helpful if you go on camera and ask it yourself. But now I will turn the session over to our moderator, Ms. Shirley Wilson. She's a member of our MTAP steering committee, and she's with Mississippi DOT. Shirley, please take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure of being able to moderate the last session. Like me, I've enjoyed the sessions thus far, and I think once again we are about to hear some very good information on one of the topics that I know everyone loves, the National Transit Database reporting. And of course, we also going to talk about the U.S. Census and the transit funding implications. As most of us know, that the transit systems throughout the nations have really had impact as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has significantly impacted the ridership, the way we do things. It hasn't been business as usual for a while now. So this session will actually talk about the transit data reporting, how the information for the years to come, what are we expecting? What will it look like? How does the census itself have impact on the NTD? And of course, we are very thankful to FTA for allowing pre-COVID data to be used for the 2020 apportionments. But what this session will do is explore what the data reporting requirements and how the impact will be going forward. And we got four wonderful speakers that will be discussing this right today. We have John Georges from the Office of Budget and Policy with the Federal Transit Administration. We have Mr. Grant Sparks from the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transit. We have Ms. Casey Mertz with Georgia Department of Transportation, and Dr. Laurie Garrows with the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering with Georgia Tech University. So right now, Mississippi, we're in the process of working on the NTD. It's challenging for us this year. We lost one of our staff members to the Texas DOT that actually was the one that spearheaded the effort. So now our backup team is having to come in and work with that report. So it's been a little challenging, but we are pushing forward. But we also are looking for this session to provide a lot of information, and I think it's going to be very good. And once again, you got your instructions about the chat, and let's make this last session a wonderful interactive session. So the first one, Mr. Georges. You're on mute right now.
Yes, thank you.
Here you go.
And of course, the first rule of doing any Zoom presentation is remember to unmute yourself and never fail to do that. So I'm, of course, John Georges. I'm the Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Analysis in the Federal Transit Administration headquarters, which is the office that runs the National Transit Database. Some of you may be familiar with me as before taking on the current position, I was the National Transit Database Program Manager for about 5 years before taking on this position. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So wanted to just give a little bit of background of what we're seeing from the National Transit Database data that's going on right now. So, it's kind of ironic that the COVID pandemic hit when it did. Transit ridership had been basically declining since 2014. It peaked in December 14, and just at the end of 2019 and into the first couple months of 20, it really looked like transit had turned the corner and was finally growing for the first time in 5 years. And then, of course, in March, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we literally went off the charts. And the charts that we use for our internal briefings just all had to be completely thrown out and redesigned to keep track of, to present ridership data that was previously unimaginable. April transit ridership, when most of the nation was in lockdown, was down 80% from April of 2019. And then as the lockdowns were eased in May and June, transit ridership reached a point of being down about 62%. And then that has kind of been a plateau since the end of June, when July, August through November, it's all pretty much been about this down 60%. So next slide. There we go. So the other thing that we're keeping track of, in addition to just the ridership, is what sort of mitigation strategies are transit systems undertaking. So here are 5 of the most common mitigation strategies, and we're just doing this on an ad hoc basis. This is, despite being an NTD presentation, this is not actually NTD data, but we're using the information that you all are putting, that transit systems, I should say, are putting out on their publicly available websites to keep track of what mitigation. And we've actually done a sample to look beyond just the top 50 bus systems, and have found that the top 50 is kind of a rough proxy for what the industry as a whole is doing. So we're now a pretty much universal face coverings required public transportation. About almost 2/3 have implemented driver barriers, which is about the same proportion that has reduced service, at which there's been a slow restoration of service from those that had reduced it. We're also seeing a reduction in rear door boarding, which was a policy that was put in to minimize contact with passengers with the drivers, of course, which is important because that, of course, in most systems that are doing rear door boarding aren't collecting any fare revenue. And then lastly, the least common mitigation measure is reduced seating capacity. So there have been some efforts in transit systems to reduce the number of seats to kind of increase the amount of social distancing, and try and create a little additional space between passengers. So next slide. All right, so fiscal year 2021 began on October 1st, 2020. We are still awaiting full year appropriations from Congress, so we're not making our apportionments yet for federal fiscal year 2021 until Congress passes a full year budget. We're all hopeful that they're going to pass a full year budget by the end of this week, so hopefully that will be breaking news for us. When that does happen, apportionments will be run as normal, and all those apportionments will be based on 2019 NTD data. So the most important thing that this means is that there's no impact from COVID-19 on the apportionments that FTA will be distributing once we get a full year budget. So if Congress does pass a full year budget, this Friday, it'll take us a couple weeks to take those numbers and run the apportionment, and you'd imagine that we'd be publishing apportionment data tables in January. But all of that will be pre-pandemic impacts. So 2019 ended December 31st, and there were no impacts from COVID-19 in this country, at least as of then. Go ahead and click the next, and let's go to the next slide. So the one impact that does remain in place as we head into to 2020 is that all entity requirements for in-person sampling remain suspended. If you think that there's something the FTA is requiring you to do that requires people to ride the buses to do in-person sampling, that requirement is in fact suspended. So in general, what this means is that you can use pre-pandemic sample data. You can use pre-pandemic sample data to file a good faith NTD report. So the most common reason to use sampling data and filing an NTD report is to get average passenger trip length to report passenger miles and And you may use your pre-pandemic average passenger trip lengths until the pandemic is over, and that will be in place through at least through June of this year. That those requirements will all be suspended. So the last point here is that contact your NTD analyst if you have specific sampling questions. There are a lot of other odds and ends cases out there that maybe individual transits need to sample. There's, for instance, a handful that you normally relied upon sampling to collect their ridership data. And those sorts of nitty-gritty questions are best to contact your analyst for. So next slide. So that's the state of where we are for fiscal year 21. So let's talk about fiscal year 22. So federal fiscal year 22 will begin October of 2021. Sorry. That apportionment would normally be the one based on 2020 data. So this is normally the apportionment of federal grants where we would see all those COVID-19 impacts. Now, many transit systems have seen reduced transit vehicle revenue miles by about 10 to 20%. If you go to the next point, please. So in addition to the ridership impacts, ridership is a relatively small component of the federal funding formulas, but transit vehicle revenue miles is really the main driver of the formula for systems. And to the extent that the rural formula is based on data, it's the vehicle revenue miles much more so than the ridership that's important. So if we go to the next point, so what FTA is going to do is that we are going to use 2019 data for most systems that had lower vehicle miles and lower ridership in 2020. And so the next point there is that there's no need to request an adjustment or a waiver. So normally FTA has in place a natural disaster adjustment policy. We instituted that after Hurricane Katrina to allow systems in Southern Louisiana and Mississippi that were impacted by that to use their pre-disaster data in the apportionment to not be hurt in the apportionment based on reduced service during the disaster. Obviously, in the case of a nationwide disaster, we didn't want to be in the position of processing 700, 800, 900 requests to use 2019 data in place of the apportionment. So we are going to do that on a broad cut basis, in that if we see that your vehicle revenue miles and ridership were reduced in 2020 from what you had in 2019, we are going to go ahead and use your 2019 data for the apportionment. So, but the key thing to know is that you still have to report your 2020 data. Although the use of the data for the apportionment is the one that gets all the headlines, and of course the one that's so important for so many. There is the statutory purpose of the NTD is to provide information to state governments, to Congress, to the federal government, and the general public and transit agencies on public transportation service planning. So we do want a record of what is happening to the transit industry during this time. So to record the story of transit, even if we're going to, in probably 99% of cases, end up using 2019 data for next year's apportionment. So next slide. So good. I know the future speakers after me are going to talk a little bit about Census 2020. So there's going to be a number of impacts of Census 2020 when it comes through. First of all urbanized areas will change in population in some degree, including some that will change in population tiers. Some will fall under 50,000 in population, and some of them will rise above 50,000 in population, things that are currently designated as urban clusters. There will also, of course, be some that rise above and below the 200,000 and 1 million thresholds as well. A lot of urbanized areas will absorb some rural areas into their boundaries. And then some urbanized areas will also be merging with each other. So we'll see two urbanized areas become one, which could also cause them to increase in the thresholds. So there's a whole host of impacts. So what's the timeline on which these are going to happen? If we go to the next slide. 2021 data is to be reported to the NTD as normal, with the first report deadlines beginning in October of 21. And so everyone should continue to collect your 2021 data as normal and report it to the NTD as normal. Once your many of your fiscal year 21s will begin July 1st. You collect the data as normal, and you will be reporting it to the NTD as normal. It won't be until spring of 22 that we anticipate that the Census Bureau will announce the new urbanized areas and their boundaries and their populations. So that will mean in summer of 22, the next point, please. We're going to have everyone return to the NTD after you have finished your NTD report. You're going to return in the middle of summer and report a 2021 FFA 10 form that's aligned to the new urbanized areas. So that information will be distributed, and then you'll give us the distribution of your data. At that time, oops, sorry, I thought I had one more point there. So go ahead to the next slide. So then that's all going to feed into fiscal year 2023. So fiscal year 2023 will begin on October 1st of 22. And we are going to give everyone the option to use 2019 data in lieu of your 21 data. And that will be an option that we're providing to everyone. So the new census urbanized areas will be implemented. And so when you're logging back in the summer, if you're using the 2019 data, the system will prompt you to use that 2019 data and allocate it across the new urbanized areas as if those urbanized areas had existed at that time. But then the real wild card in there is that federal transit formulas are also currently scheduled to expire September 30th of 2021. So there's the possibility that we could have a reauthorization law that could change the formulas, what data is used in the formula, that could change the population thresholds. So in addition to new urbanized areas, we could have a new reauthorization in place, and of course the possibility that we'll be using 2 different years of data, with some systems using their 2019 data and some of them using their 21 data. So it's all going to be really complicated, but we have been thinking it through. We're going to try and make the process as smooth for everyone to make the process work and keep the federal grants coming out the door. So I'm happy to take questions now, or if Shirley, if you prefer to save questions for the end of the panel, I'm happy to do that too. And Shirley, you're on mute.
Shirley, you're muted.
I'm unmuting. Okay, there are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
So
I think we should ask Mr. Dave Harris to open his
Yeah.
mic, because it's quite a long question.
this question is quite long.
Mr. Harris.
Hey everyone. Hey John, how are you? Hope you're well. So I don't know if you'll have an answer for this question, just because it's part of the recent COVID relief bill that has seemed to be growing legs by the minute. And there's operating caps in that bill,
Right.
and the language in the bill it's based on the 2018 NTD data. So the operating caps are 75% of operating costs for 5307 and 150% for 5311. So so for instance, if you have an urban agency that received just $10 million in CARES, and then their annual their annual operating expenses are $9 million, well, you're way above 100%, so you wouldn't receive any of this new COVID relief money.
Yep.
And then it's 150% for the 5311. And so my first question was, if this goes through in this format, would NTD and, well, FTA be supplying, official data numbers that could be compared against, so we know where we stand and we know what the expectations are? And I know the proposed language already, there may not be any money for rurals, because I think all rurals may not meet this threshold. So the states may not meet that threshold. But the first question is, will NTD or FTA be supplying that official number? So,
Right.
50 of us don't do our due diligence, end up with 50 different numbers. And
yes. All right. So obviously the number one caveat, of course, is that this is a draft bill that is under active negotiation. And so we do not know what the final results of that negotiation will end up at. So rather than dive into specifics, I can talk generally. So let's say that Congress passes a second COVID relief bill, a CARES Act 2, which offers money based on, with a cap in it that no area may receive more than a certain percentage of a certain amount of money compared to their total operating expenses. And what this means is that FTA will treat this just like a formula run, just like we would normally do at the beginning of the fiscal year. In fact, like we're preparing to do for the start of fiscal year 22. So we will take that money and we will divvy it up among all the urbanized areas and all the state rural areas. And then we will apply the caps, and then whatever's in excess of the cap, we will then redistribute to all the areas that were under the cap until all the money has been distributed. And we'll do that regardless of whatever cap will be. So it will be based on NTD data. It will be a calculation that FTA will perform. And we will, and then we'll make the data tables and calculations available. But I think it is also, putting my NTD hat on, it is kind of speaks to the importance of making sure that due diligence is applied to an NTD report when it's submitted, because of course when we were all submitting our 2018 NTD reports, for most areas, operating expenses was not an apportionment factor. So no one could have anticipated that at some point in the future, Congress would be looking at that to use that as an apportionment factor. But because of the high reputation that the NTD has, Congress treats NTD data as definitive, and so can choose to use that, and that's absolutely in play as we think ahead towards reauthorization. If those who are making negotiations on Congress have ideas for different ways they want to distribute money according to formula, when they want a definitive answer, they go to the NTD to get the definitive answer for that basis.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I'm glad you guys are going to be assisting. I just have a follow-up.
Sure.
So for this same scenario, in an urban area, where let's say there's two agencies, and one agency received, just to throw out numbers, let's say the whole urbanized area received 20 million, but one of the urbans received 5 million in CARES and one received 15. And the one who received 15 million, their operating expenses are 10 million a year. So obviously they're not going to get any of this new money because they're over.
Right.
150% over.
Yeah.
But so my question
so a lot of your, yeah. So if maybe I could,
go ahead.
Yeah, maybe it just comes there. So a lot of your question there will really depend on the precise way that the legislation is written. But I will say the most likely scenario is that most formula that FTA executes are based on the urbanized area rather than the agency. So I would anticipate that if Congress is designing a new formula, like we're hearing they're talking about, that most likely that formula would also be based on urbanized area. And so what we would do is for a given urbanized area, we would add up the data for all transit agencies within that urbanized area. So the urbanized area would get a sum total operating expenses from all agencies in that area, and that would be compared to the total CARES Act amount. That would be compared to the total CARES Act amount for that urbanized area to see what additional money they might be eligible for to get up to whatever the cap level is ultimately.
Right. And like, you know, and I could see you guys wanting to do that. And the reason why I asked is because I think, you know, an urban transit agency that has commuter rail would probably be getting a lot more money than one that just had bus. And so that bus agency may not have, you know, because the 5307 CARES money was really a combination, right, of the 5337 and 5307. Mm-hmm. So whereas that commuter rail agency could be receiving more than 75% easily, where a bus only agency in that same area may not be receiving as much, because under the CARES money, they divvied it up by 5337 and 5307. So that could be just an issue that comes up that you guys should just keep in mind if you don't look at it by a single agency. And
right, yeah, you know, and as I will say, it will depend on what is the final legislative language that is hammered out by the negotiators. But if it runs like most formulas have run, we'll be aggregating the data by urbanized area, and so then from this, you know, CARES Act 2 money, the urbanized area will get a lump sum allocation from FTA, and then using their metropolitan planning process and the designated recipient, they will be able to designate which specific operators from within that urbanized area are able to tap into that money. And then if there is a 5311 apportionment in the CARES Act 2, the same thing is that we will add up all the rural operators for the state, and the state DOT will then have the discretion to decide how to divvy up that lump sum that we give you from the formula. So that is the most likely. And then the last point that I'll just leave you with is that, you know, of course, you know, a lot of these nitty-gritty concerns and the hammering out of legislation, I'm sure that AASHTO plays a role for you in voicing these concerns, you know, at the table in Washington with the, you know, appropriate representatives and senators who might be negotiating this.
All right.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Thank you also. I noticed that there was one other comment in the chat here, and it's from mine. It says, I'm in submitting NTD for RY 2020. We received comments back that we could request to use RY 20 data instead of RY 19 if it was more favorable. Is this the case, and could you comment on that?
Yes. So, you know, so what FTA is doing here is we have, you know, again, going back to Hurricane Katrina, we have a long-standing hold harmless policy that in the annual apportionment, we don't want any state or any urbanized area to suffer unduly in the apportionment because of the ill timing of a natural disaster. So with COVID-19 being effectively a nationwide disaster, what we're going to do is we're going to automatically look, and you know, because vehicle revenue miles is the most important formula factor, that's the first thing we're going to look at is, you know, did your vehicle revenue miles go down in 20 from 19? And if it did go down, we're going to assume that you would want to use your 19 data. Now, there may be a few systems out there for which their 20 data is more favorable than their 19. Maybe in 20 you added service and you never really cut back service due to the pandemic. Maybe you were in a state that never really locked down. So, you know, unlike some of the big cities that ridership go, you know, 60% below baseline, maybe your ridership never went that far below baseline because your state never really locked down. If you're concerned about that, you can absolutely reach out to your analyst and say, hey, we're pretty sure that our 20 data was higher than our 19. And we want to make sure that we're on the list of systems that where the 20 data is used and not the 19. You know, I think we'll do a pretty good job of, you know, making sure that we're picking the higher of the two. But if you do have additional concern about that, you can always register that with your analyst, and they'll take note of that. And again, this will be this will be something that we'll be doing next summer once all of our 20 data is in. It'll be next July, next August that we'll be going through and seeing how many systems it benefits to substitute in their 19 data for instead of their 20.
There are a couple of the chats in. If you all want to open up your mics and ask those questions, that would be fine.
Let's start with Joaquin.
Joaquin,
Dean,
Yoakum.
Yoakum.
Yes.
okay, Yoakum.
So my question is FTA keeping track of the systems that are suspending and reducing fare collection due to COVID?
Yep. So we are, so right now that's not an entity data point, but I actually do have a team of analysts that were using publicly available data to keep track of the top 50 plus a sample, top 50 bus systems and a sample of others, which is providing us with a kind of an estimate of how many systems nationwide are suspending fare collection. So that's how we're doing it right now. We're definitely well aware that a lot of systems have suspended fare collection, and that's impacting the bottom line for the transit systems to be able to sustain service. And that's been part of our message, when Congress has reached out to us saying that, hey, there's a lot of fares out there not being collected, and that is an ongoing threat to the ability to sustain transit service, particularly for essential workers.
Okay. All right.
All right, I think we should go on to our next presenter.
Next.
What do you think?
Yes. So let's go on for the sake of time, to our next presenter, which will be Mr. Grant Sparks from Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me? All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Grant Sparks, and I'm the Manager of Transit Planning and Corridor Development for the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. And I'll be providing a state-level perspective on performance data reporting, specifically the performance data that we collect from our transit agencies here in Virginia. I'll be discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on transit ridership, as well as the effects on transit funding. So quickly, just an overview. I'll start with a quick summary of the state of transit in Virginia. I'll talk about how Virginia's transit funding is distributed between our various grant programs, including our operating assistance program, capital program, and some of our special programs that we have. I'll touch on our state operating assistance methodology, which is based on transit agency performance data and has obviously been impacted by COVID. I'll go over the specific data that we collect from our transit agencies and some ridership trends, both pre and post-COVID. And then I'll close with some overarching impacts of COVID on transit in Virginia. Next slide. So here in Virginia, we have 40 agencies throughout the state that operate transit service, and that's not including WMATA, which is one of the largest transit agencies in the country serving the DC region. And they have service in Northern Virginia, so that would actually bring that total to 41 agencies. Our agencies operate a wide variety of transit modes, including heavy rail, which is WMATA, light rail operated by Hampton Roads Transit, commuter rail operated by the Virginia Railway Express, or VRE, in Northern Virginia. We have a ferry service in the Hampton Roads area. We have bus rapid transit in both Richmond and Northern Virginia. We have your traditional fixed route bus service and the demand responsive service. It's also not on this slide, but we have a number of agencies that also provide commuter bus service in our large urban areas. So statewide, including the riders who use WMATA in Virginia, we had roughly 172 million transit riders in FY19, which was the last full year of normal data. Mirroring what John presented at the national level, Here in Virginia, we experienced an increase in ridership from FY18 to FY19, and we were on track to see yet another increase in FY20, but that was obviously abruptly halted by COVID. Next slide. So in Virginia, we're very fortunate to have a robust mass transit fund. During the 2020 Virginia General Assembly session, an omnibus transportation bill was signed by the governor that raised the gas tax and tied the tax to inflation after 2 years of implementation. The bill also streamlined revenues to the Commonwealth's Transportation Trust Fund, of which the Mass Transit Fund now receives 23% of, so a significant slice of that pie. This bill went through a number of renditions, but as it was signed, it included a 43% increase in statewide transit revenues, which was obviously a significant amount. In a number of ways, this was a landmark bill for transit in Virginia, and it all occurred right before COVID-19. So we really lucked out on the timing of this. But on this slide, you can see our distribution of revenues within the Mass Transit Fund, which includes a 46.5% cutout sent to WMATA, 27% of the Mass Transit Fund goes to our operating assistance program, which I'll talk about in just a moment. 18% goes to our capital program, 6% now goes to a newly established transit ridership incentive program, or TRIP program, which encourages zero fare pilot programs and the implementation of new regional transit services. And then lastly, 2.5% goes to the special grant programs that we have, which include technical assistance, demonstration, and intern. Estimates on revenues have been thrown upside down due to COVID, but to give everyone just a sense of where we were prior to COVID, these programs totaled more than 300 million as we prepared our FY20 program of projects. So initial projections before COVID were suggesting that we would get certainly over $100 million in additional transit funding per year, perhaps even closer to 150 million. But again, revenue projections have been a little hard to come by because of the COVID implications. Next slide. So a few years ago, a series of transit reforms made its way through the General Assembly, which required state transit operating assistance to be allocated based on performance metrics. So as a result, a Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee was formed to help develop an operating assistance formula that included performance metrics, as opposed to just using sizing metrics. And this committee included transit agency operators as well as stakeholders. The methodology that was ultimately recommended and approved by the Commonwealth Transportation Board included six guiding principles: promoting fiscal responsibility, supporting robust transit, improving transit ridership, incentivizing efficiency in transit operations, promoting mobility, as well as supporting social safety. Next slide. So here's a look at how the state operating assistance formula actually works. Starting at the top of this flow chart, once the revenues are determined for our operating assistance program, a sizing metric is calculated, which takes into account each agency's annual operating cost, annual ridership, annual vehicle revenue hours, and vehicle revenue miles. Additionally, a commuter sizing metric is incorporated in the formula to account for the long distances traveled by commuter rail passengers. Once the sizing metric is determined, we then factor in our performance adjustments, which takes into account 5 specific performance metrics: passengers per hour, passengers per mile, cost per hour, cost per mile, and cost per passenger. The final step is to make sure that the operating assistance allocation that we provide to each agency does not exceed 30% of an agency's total operating budget. Next slide. So in order to run this operating assistance formula, DRPT obviously has to collect some data from our transit agencies, and we validate that performance data on both a monthly and an annual basis. On a monthly basis, we collect ridership, revenue hours, and revenue miles from our transit agencies. And then annually, we collect passenger miles traveled, as well as agency operating expenses. Understanding that transit agencies experience some degree of variability in their performance data year to year, especially with ridership, we smooth out the operating assistance allocation by using a 3-year rolling average of each agency's data. So for example, if an agency has a particularly bad ridership year, just kind of out of the blue, they won't be hit as hard in their operating assistance allocation because we also use the 2 years prior. On the flip side, if an agency increases their transit ridership significantly, which has happened to some of our agencies, they won't truly reap those rewards until they've sustained that increase in transit ridership for 3 years. Next slide. So that was a quick overview of how our state operating assistance formula works and the data that we collect, which is heavily, the operating assistance formula is heavily weighted on transit ridership and service productivity and efficiency. So then there was the fallout of COVID with all of our data. And this graph shows monthly transit ridership for our Virginia transit agencies, not including WMATA. If I included the months in 2017 and 2016 on this graph, you'd see that the monthly ridership was hovering closer to 4 million riders per month. So as I mentioned earlier, we were on an upward trajectory in 2020 until March, when it all kind of came crashing down. At the onset of COVID, DRPT did issue guidance to all transit agencies in the state, encouraging social distancing practices on buses and in facilities, adding frequencies wherever possible to help with that social distancing, suspending fare collection wherever possible, as well as encouraging essential trips only. So as a result of all this, transit ridership statewide, not including WMATA, was down 73% compared to 2019. And that was for April, which was the first full month of COVID impacted data. Looking at the impacts agency by agency, no one really escaped without having some declines in transit ridership, although it was our urban providers who generally saw larger decreases than the rural providers, at least during the first few months. Perhaps because it took longer for COVID to reach some of those more remote parts of the state. But as you can see on this graph, transit ridership does slowly start to creep upwards beginning in May. And then as it relates to our operating assistance formula, this obviously turned things on its head because prior to COVID, we were encouraging efficiency and trying to incentivize transit ridership. And then practically overnight, we didn't want the general public to even use transit, and we did our best to limit transit usage to essential trips only. Next slide. So the previous graph was for Virginia transit agencies, but I also wanted to show you how serious the ridership impacts were on WMATA ridership in Northern Virginia. WMATA is not included in the operating assistance allocation that we have, as they get a separate cutout of our revenues. But their Virginia ridership fell by 94% in April compared to April of 2019. So I think in April of 2019, they had over 10 million riders. And then in April 2020, it was under 600,000 riders. but they too have been slowly ticking up since bottoming out in April. Next slide. So as for the impacts of COVID, our leadership did a really good job of recognizing the seriousness of the pandemic very early on, and issued $11 million in additional state operating assistance to our agencies in mid-March. We were able to do this by leveraging some deobligated funds from previous projects. We also worked closely with our transit agencies and our program managers to close out and deobligate any projects that had already been completed and had any unused balances, essentially shaking the trees. As I'm sure this is the case with many agencies, we were going through the budget process as COVID hit. So we had to put a hold on some of our FY21 transit grant programs, but we were able to keep the faucets open on our state operating assistance because we provided the funding in waves. So instead of an agency gaining access to a full year's worth of funding on July 1st, we gave them 1/4 of their funding. And then as revenues became more clear, we provided additional funds. Miraculously, when all was said and done, most of our transit agencies actually received an increase in FY21 operating assistance, which was made possible not because of that omnibus transportation bill, but actually because we were given the ability to shift some of our funds between grant programs. And we felt that our biggest priority was to keep folks on the operating side whole. So as I mentioned earlier, our operating assistance formula incorporates various performance metrics. And this coming fiscal year, we would typically be using FY20 performance data to plug into our formula. But because of the significant declines in ridership and the fact that we were actually discouraging transit use beginning in March, hoping to keep trips limited to just essential trips, we felt that it just wasn't appropriate to use FY20 data in our formula. Thus, similar to the folks at FTA and NTD, we will be using FY19 data and then also incorporating the 2 years prior to get our 3-year rolling average. So FY20 really becomes a lost year in many different ways, including our ability to use it in our operating assistance allocation formula. One thing that we have yet to, I think, discuss is what we're going to be doing with our FY21 data. It's interesting to hear on the federal side that it might be up to an agency to determine whether or not they want to incorporate their 21 data or use prior year 19 data. But that has yet to be discussed, I think, at DRPT, but it's something that we're going to have to tackle here fairly soon. And then I guess I'll close by just saying that we are continuing to ask our transit agencies to submit data to us on a monthly basis, and we continue to validate that data because, as John said earlier, we're still trying to record the story of transit during the pandemic. So it is important for our agencies to continue to send that data to us. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has them.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple, and one thing I've noticed that the chats, people have been responding to each other, so that's really good. But there is one in here from John Pratt, and if you wanted to open up and just ask this question, or I can read it. Okay, I'll read it. It says to Grant, for the ridership trends, what explains the peaks and valleys in ridership based on the months increase and decreases July 18 to April 20th? Yeah,
that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. If I had to guess, I'm looking at the graph right now. The valleys that you see on that graph were in November and December, as well as May, June. And we do have a number of transit agencies in Virginia that operate around colleges and universities. And obviously those months, students sometimes go home for the holidays or aren't using transit. Here in Richmond, GRTC, which is the transit operator, they have a universal pass agreement with Virginia Commonwealth University, which is a pretty sizable university. And so students ride for free all year long. But obviously when they aren't here, they're not using the service. So I think that's what's going on with the peaks and valleys. But I'm not entirely sure about that, but a good question.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. So you indicated that when you're using your performance metrics to make adjustments to the allocations, and you're using 3-year smoothing to take into account any drastic impacts that those might have. It looks like up to about 30% of what their normal allocation would be, if I'm kind of reading along with what you were indicating. I'm wondering about, so if you make the wrong guess and you are reducing their allocation based on performance metrics by say 25%, and in the operating year that they got the allocation, they have an increase in ridership and an increase in cost. Do you have the ability to, given that you only give them an allocation based on a quarterly basis, have a contingency fund available to make those adjustments where necessary to keep them whole?
So we only provided the operating assistance on a quarterly basis due to COVID. Usually we make available the entire operating allocation, the entire year's worth of funding we make available on July 1st. So the quarterly payments were essentially just a one-time thing due to COVID. Do we have any rules built in for those one-off situations like you mentioned? We actually, when we first implemented this operating assistance formula, we did have some instances like that, and we did a one-time I guess smooth it over payment to some of those agencies that were adversely impacted. But moving forward, no. Basically the formula is what it is. I did want to just clarify the 30% cap that we have. So that is a cap on the agency's expenses, essentially. So we compare once we run the operating assistance formula and we get a value for each transit agency, we go back and look at the total operating expenses on an annual basis for each of those agencies and make sure that whatever we are providing does not exceed that 30% cap. If it does, then we bring it back down to 30%.
Okay. All right, thank you. Don, you have your hand raised. You have a question?
Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, I also had a question about the averaging. And I was going in a slightly different direction. Is the, I guess, how has it been received? Did you vet it with your external partners? Do they like the averaging? I know one of the things I hear a lot about formula brands that we manage is they just want to be able to predict what's coming. And I imagine the averaging really helps with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helped that we had an advisory committee really kind of vet this formula, and that advisory committee was made up of transit operators and stakeholders. I personally haven't heard any complaints about the averaging. I would agree that, you know, it's always better just from a planning perspective to have some degree of certainty and confidence of what you're going to be receiving from year to year. So I do think that incorporating that average has been generally well received, because I haven't heard otherwise.
Thanks.
All right. All right. There are several other comments in here. Mrs. Eilinger, did you want to mention your comment that you made in the chat box? Chris?
Shirley, I think we can actually hold on comments until like the discussion and Q&A section at the end, and let's let Georgia DOT and Georgia Tech make their presentation.
Let's move on then. All right, the next person will be Ms. Casey Merce from Georgia DOT.
Hi, everyone. All right, looks like I'm having trouble turning my video back on. That's okay. I'm Casey Mertz. I'm the Transit Program Manager at Georgia DOT. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. For some reason, I can't start my video again, but that's okay. Oh, there it is. Hi. All right, so good afternoon. I'm Casey Mertz. I'm the Transit Program Manager at Georgia DOT. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about some population trends that we're seeing in Georgia and some ways in which our Georgia transit agencies are starting to prepare for the upcoming census. And then Dr. Guerra with Georgia Tech, she'll take over and share her national level research on population growth projections and talk about some really interesting implications for the transit industry. So a little bit about Georgia. At Georgia DOT, we administer the Rural 5311, the 5307 small urban, and the planning programs for our state. So within our program, we oversee about 80 rural providers, 7 small urbans, 2 intercity bus providers, and a whole slew of MPOs and regional planning agencies. Most of our rural 5311 subrecipients, which are the green areas in the map here, are single county demand response systems. Some of them, about 5 of them, operate regionally, so either on a regional commission basis or small groupings of counties. And a few of them do offer coordinated services with human service transportation programs. On the urban side, we have several counties in the state that operate both rural and urban systems, and those are the pink counties on the map there. Sometimes those urban and rural are operated by the same jurisdiction or the same county, and in other places you might have a regional rural system that overlaps with a small urban or a large urban. So there's a lot of different ways in which that's happening. And then you see the big blue area kind of on the north middle part of the state, and that's of course Metro Atlanta. You don't have to be from Atlanta or from Georgia to know, to be familiar with Atlanta's notorious sprawl. So that area does cover 13 counties, and it's got a wide variety of urban, suburban, exurban type characteristics. GDOT actually has 5 different rural 5311 subrecipients within that Metro Atlanta area. So those are partners that we're, coordinating very closely with. There are concerns there with at least a couple of them about them being wrapped into the large urban picture with the next census. So there is, but yeah, at the same time, there's still very, very rural feeling parts of those counties. So there still exists a need for rural demand response transit. So that's kind of a challenge for us, working with those subrecipients to make sure their systems are set up in a way that works for their county. Okay, next slide. There you go. So on the left side of this slide, just shows some population projections for our state in Georgia, and this shows our projections between today and the year 2050, and this is from our State Office of Planning and Budget, so it's going to differ a little bit from the research that Lori Garrow did. But we're seeing, I mean, you can see right here, I mean, Georgia is one of those really fast growing states. And it's especially true for our urban areas. Our urban areas are growing through migration from other states. And we're also growing through folks, you know, leaving, especially kind of younger populations, leaving the rural parts of the state and moving to where the jobs are in some of our urban centers. And then on the right side of the screen, this is from our statewide transit plan. This just shows, if you look at these different breakdowns, it shows how much, again, how much faster our urban areas are growing than our rural areas. So this is population growth since 2010. So I kind of did it backwards. I did the historical before the projections. But it shows, you know, again, how much faster our urban areas are growing, but also we broke it out by areas with transit and without transit. So you really see like a strong nexus here between population and job growth too. You know, when transit is present in a community, it's a real, of course, I mean, we all know that that's a real economic boom. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so what are we doing in Georgia? We know that the census is looming, you know, ahead of us. And we have many parts of our state that are, you know, urbanizing, and we probably expect them to, you know, switch over from 5311 to 5307 in the near future. There are a couple, actually two new small urban areas. They're not new urban areas, but they're small urban areas who are working to stand up new 5307 service by the next calendar year. So that, you know, prep work is happening right now. So that's very exciting for those communities. And that's the city of Brunswick and the city of Valdosta. Both of those areas are currently served by rural demand response systems. And so I, you know, see this as a signal that these communities have, are now noticing that the rural service just wasn't meeting their needs anymore. And so they've taken that next step of deciding to stand up 5307 service. So we're very happy to work with them on that. Another thing that we're doing with our subrecipients is just helping with regional transit development plans. So in addition to those two cities that are starting new service, there are a whole slew of MPO areas and other small urban areas across the state who are working on or who have developed transit development plans. So they're just exploring, seeing what different kinds of options are out there, different types of service models, financial models, et cetera. We recently at GDOT just finished our first statewide transit plan. And one of those recommendations was to develop a guidebook for developing regional transit plans. So that's something that we're working on now. That guidebook is underway. And one of our emphasis areas is going to be you know, that need for coordination at a regional level across service areas, across jurisdictions, and especially that connection between rural areas and our urban areas where, you know, you have job opportunities and healthcare centers and that sort of thing. A few years back, our GDOT transit program developed a trending urban policy, which is outlined in our 5311 program guide. And that was really just to help us prepare those 5311 counties that are experiencing really rapid urbanization to eventually be able to transition over to a 5307 program. And of course, we got some help from Dr. Garrow on this, and she'll talk a little bit later. But we decided to incorporate a couple of additional factors in our 5311 award methodology. And so we use some of the similar factors that Virginia talked about earlier in their calculations. But we added for those counties that we sort of flagged as trending urban, we added some additional factors like the percent of their population that's rural, and then we're also looking at the geographic distribution of the trips that they delivered in prior years. And so this kind of helps us on two fronts. It makes sure that our 5311 program is compliant, and we're definitely doing, you know, rural trips, or at least one end of our trip is in a rural area, but it also helps those subrecipients to sort of really understand the implications of the transit and start preparing themselves for potentially transitioning to 5307 programs. So looking forward, I think that the new small urban service doesn't necessarily have to be like a traditional fixed route type system. Some jurisdictions, especially in Georgia, are really hesitant and kind of slow to take on such a large endeavor. It seems like a big investment for those smaller cities. And we're seeing, even in Georgia, some of the small urbans considering some other innovative models and partnering with private sector. A couple systems in Georgia recently have done micromobility projects. And even one of the new small urbans that I mentioned earlier, they're planning to stand up their new service using a dynamic demand response model. It's very similar, I think synonymous with microtransit. So finally, GDOT is really fortunate to live right across the street from Georgia Tech in Midtown Atlanta. We've had some really great partnerships with the Georgia Tech faculty, including Dr. Garrow. So I'm going to turn it over to her. We did partner with her, sponsored some research to look at population and urbanization projections in the state. And then she's also going to share some facts on her national level research as well, and how best to prepare for the next census.
Thank you, Casey. I appreciate that transition. Thank you. Of
course.
So next slide. So as background for those of you that were at this meeting last year, I basically was invited to come in and presented a study that we had done at Georgia Tech that was trying to drill down into the questions that John had asked earlier in the presentation, specifically related to, look, we got a census coming up. We know that the population is going to shift. Things in many states might be getting more urban. They may be getting more rural. What do we have to worry about in terms of funding? Are we going to lose 5311 funding? Are certain transit systems going to get absorbed into urban areas? And the motivation for this was really, if you look at where the population had changed from 2010 to 2020, we see 2-digit number growths. The percent population change the last time the decennial census occurred was pretty high in certain states like Texas and Florida. And moving on to the next slide. Maybe. The concern with, while we see overall population growth increasing, it's not all uniform. So the growth is urbanizing rural populations. And just as a nation, the rural populations are declining nationally. So if you look at Georgia, for instance, the non-urbanized population may be projected to go down by 5%. So these tend to be big numbers, right, on the funding formulas coming in, or clearly for planning, we have the appropriation formula that may change, but we also have this underlying population shift. And going on to the next slide, some of the big questions that we wanted to look at specifically for this year's meeting was, how will COVID-19 potentially affect future transit funding? And two factors are at play, right? One of them is that we all know the operational metrics are lower, but on the other hand, FTA and others are protecting us on us, meaning, we can use our fiscal 19-year data, so that's not as concerned. But, the other thing is we conducted the census during a pandemic, right? So our population forecasts might be lower than we expected. Again, I don't want to get into politics on that, but I think it's something in the back of our minds is what happens, for instance, if not all people were counted, how is that going to affect our appropriation? So going on to next slide, what I wanted to talk about then is let's just do a quick review of the urban and rural transit funding programs, look at the factors that go into the current appropriation formulas, and do a deep dive. Like, I didn't have a sense going in of when we're talking about population metrics versus operational metrics, which matters more, right? How much of the dollars that Georgia is getting, or each one of our states, is coming from the population versus coming from operating? So we've done some back of the envelope calculations to help explain that, to, if you want, quantify our risk. And then we are at a position where we can talk about potential funding implications then after the 2020 census. Okay, next slide. So reviewing of our favorite topic, right? How the appropriations work. So let's do just a quick review. Next slide. So there's two main programs that most of us, again, are intimately aware of for the transit funding sources, the 5311 rural program and the 5307 urban program. The key thing here is rural areas apply for areas less than 50,000, urban areas for population areas, for areas that have population greater than 50,000. Next slide. Why this is important, it sort of as a bottom line is, frankly, we'd all, I think, like to use our federal funds towards supporting our operating assistance. That tends to be, I think, where the pinch points on operating transit are. And so 5311 is nice because you can use, with match, all of your 5311 towards operating. Small urban is the same on the 5307, and large urban basically has a 100 bus rule that kicks into play, that basically, if you're a smaller system operating less than 100 buses or less than 75 has a different threshold, you can use a portion of it towards operating assistance. So from a planning perspective, looking after the census, the question is, if I'm going to lose some of that operating assistance, how am I going to backfill that in with other types of funding? And I know, John, in some of the states are worried as well, you might be going or losing population looking at it. But when we had done our study, because if you lose population, you tend to be going from basically more restrictive criteria on how you're using your funding to less restrictive criteria. We basically focused in on the growing problem, not the reduction problem. Next slide. So the transit funding formulas, next slide, really have these flow charts, right? So the way I like to view the flow charts is, the flow charts is what is written into legislation that tells you for a given amount of money that Congress decides to appropriate it, how it's going to flow down to the states or the various programs. So this is, you have some of these branches basically for Appalachian areas, for oversight, Indian reservations. But the key thing is apportionment to the state on the bottom has a lot of the factors that we want to look at. So next slide. What we do though is that to apply those formulas, it's, I don't want to know, frankly, if I look at like the population of Georgia versus everybody else, what my proportion is, or to be able to calculate it. So FTA provides data tables that basically tell you what the value or the worth is of each one of those inputs. So population based on one part of that formula tells me I'm going to get $4.72. Land area appears twice. So this is telling you, if you will, what the dollar conversion amount is for each one of those inputs. But again, I don't know about you, I still don't have a sense of what the rural land area would be in a particular area. So next slide. To get an intuition for that, I pulled some of the numbers for Georgia rural, just to be able to get a sense for how much of that formula is being driven by, let's say, population versus our operation metrics. And again, using Georgia as an example, we can see about 83% of the funding depends on population metrics, the population and low income populations. Only about 6%, right, is based on operational metrics. So again, I would come back that, well, it's great, FTA is allowing us to use prior year data. For the rural systems, we likely have more exposure in terms of errors, let's say, in the 2020 decennial counts than we do on the operational metrics. So we're going to just, put this in, our head right now and move on and look at a comparison with the urban formula. And then I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so next slide. So urban formula, right? You can see the negotiations that must have occurred on getting this appropriation formula out, and some of the earlier discussions that were happening in this workshop in terms of, I'm worried about the bus tier versus the fixed guideway tier on operating, because clearly those are different. Well, I would argue the other legislatures agreed with you and put up this complicated formula to try to get some of those concerns reconciled. So similar to what we saw before, next slide, we also have these data values that apply that correspond back to the formulas. What I did, next slide, is instead of showing you all of the pieces, I'm going to show you a summary because the formula does get pretty complex. So in Georgia, if we have about 103 million, let's say, contribution coming in the 5307 program, the first three, the population and density, low income population, that's about half, that's 49%. The bus VRM or vehicle revenue miles is about a quarter, 24%. Other operating data, which mostly relates to like heavy rail and other modes, is another 24%. So we do see a different exposure, if you will, on the operating metrics at the urban side versus the rural side, with here about 50% related to the population. So moving on, next slide. On the surface, right, we look at this and I would say we are concerned. But based on the results we did last time, next slide, it's important to remember that that appropriation formula not only depends on what's happening on my state, but what's happening in everyone else's state. So based on the analysis we showed last year, we had predicted based on the population changes, holding everything else constant, meaning the prior year 2019 NTD data, that the 5307 appropriation should increase for many states. This is just following the trend, or if you look at it based on John's point earlier, when we look at the appropriation formula, there's going to be more money, if you want to view at current levels, that's needed in the 5307 program, especially for those under $1 million. So we're seeing a need for increases in 5307, some quite large. If you look at Georgia, 23 to 24%. What's going to be relevant here, though, in terms of population and things that may have gotten screwed up on the census is, fortunately, when we did our analysis, we did what we called an upper bound and lower bound, which went to assumptions on, we're not quite sure the population is going to grow this much. We're not quite sure the density is going to mean absorb into Atlanta or DC or other large metro area. And so we, if you will, you looked at the sensitivity relative to what was going on in that state for all the states as a whole. And, some of the numbers do change a lot, but like Texas is -1 to 1. Georgia's 23 to 24. For the most part, with a few exceptions, the numbers were pretty stable. So they were robust, let's say, to what might be construed as errors that might be coming in on the census. Next slide. 5311 we felt was going to remain relatively stable, and these percentages are minuscule, meaning even though the population that we saw earlier, the funding allocation formula was highly sensitive to the population, or heavily weighted, let's say, towards the population. As a whole, the growth trends are occurring so that the relative amount of 5311 funding, should stay the same. It's fairly robust to, let's say, errors in the population. Next slide. So the other thing I just want to remind everyone of, next slide, and I'll put this in the chat room afterwards, is that the Georgia Department of Transportation commissioned us to do a report, basically looking at how areas trending urban were going to be impacted after the 2020 census on their transit funding. As part of that, for each one of the states, we produced forecast of the amount of 5311 funding as well as 5307 funding that we expected to come in after the 2020 decennial census. And we also identified the urban clusters that we felt were going to become, let's say, urban areas or small urbans after the 50,000 threshold, and other areas that would be absorbed into urban areas as part of that study. We've moved the link to it off the main site, but I do have a website that you can go to download the final report. And again, from the point of view of, what's important here, if our census numbers are screwed up, I just, again, this sort of has some population forecast, which we could think about as errors, for the purposes now baked into it. And, this is really the differences here, for the most part, again, I would argue they're relatively stable. So the bigger questions are, how are we going to do that appropriation formula? How much is going to come to my state? At least in my view, that's much more important than, getting worried that, my particular state census might be off. Just because things tend to be mitigated, it's what's happening in my state versus all others. And that tends to be a little bit more stable, let's say, as a forecast. Next slide. So Richard asked me again to sort of put my stake in the ground and say, what do I think is going to happen? And, my summary of this mini analysis we did is that, yeah, okay, we do see that the rural transit funding is more at risk if the census counts are off, but given it's all relative, we should be fine. And the bigger questions, again, are really focused on, we need to make sure the next appropriation formulas coming in really reflect the needs of where, the population has been moving with, in my view, a focus on really making those areas 1 million or less, make sure they get enough transit funding. Next slide. So again, I'd like to thank the team at Georgia Tech that helped work on the initial study, and feel free to open it up to any questions to Casey and myself.
Thank you all for your thorough presentation. I know that there were previous chat conversations going on. If anyone has anything, we have a little time. I think we close this session at 2:30. So if you want to open up your mics and ask your questions or comments, this is the time. Anyone? This is the fact that the day has gotten long.
I say,
This
uh-oh, now
can't-
Dr. Garrow's the only thing standing between me and a cocktail, right? That's
This can't be. This is not a quiet group. Where is everybody? Questions for Dr. Garrow? Questions for Casey Mertz? Questions for anybody on the panel?
Yes.
All right.
Everybody is quieting. But I think all the presentations were great. I appreciate the wealth of information myself as we are looking at going forward with the NTD and also whatever the implications that'll be of the census. Otherwise, I'm turning it over to you, Richard, and I appreciate having the opportunity to moderate. I'm very glad to be here. I informed him before everybody got on that I myself had a bout with that COVID and just got back this week. So
Todd, take it away.
That's it.
So thank you, everybody. So I want everyone to find the little clapping emoji on the Zoom. It's because I'm going to give out a bunch of thank yous. I'd also like you to think about what's that one nugget, and you can put that you got out of here that you're really going to take away. I actually had a couple today that I had. I definitely did screenshots from that previous conversation. I love, it's kind of silly, but I love that idea of averaging the previous years. I know I have a formula that I do with my transits that's total boom and bust. And it makes it very hard for them to plan. So I know in my off season, I'm going to go and talk to them all about this idea of averaging. I think we all learned a lot from the way that Pennsylvania is all making us look bad by their capital construction oversight, and thinking about ways we can potentially steal from them, which is kind of the point, right? There's two main things we get out of the winter conference. It is hearing directly from FTA and what's going on with the FTA. So thank you very much, everybody, for that. It is also hearing from all of you. It is, the Dons and the Shirleys from across the country, where we get a chance to talk about all the things that we're working on together and struggling with. So those are kind of some of the things that I really love. Many thank yous. First of all, Richard Price and everyone who helped behind the scenes at AASHTO, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. He's really had to scramble and help put on now 2 conferences in virtual worlds. And I know I personally benefit from him prompting me to get stuff done and to think about different things to say as part of the conference. I think it was a huge success. All of our panelists, we really took advantage this year of probably bringing in some of our other folks to come and talk. It was really helpful. And of course, all of our moderators who were basically the steering committee. So thank you very much for all of our moderators for leading really good discussions. Thank you to our sponsors one more time. We can't do it without them. Specifically, so now we're looking at the ASHTO sponsors, but also specifically for our key partners who seem to be with us year after year. We really appreciate it. Route Match by Uber and Panther International. You all have been great. Richard, am I forgetting anything before I say thank you very much? I really hope we can do this in person next year. The more I think about it, summer's kind of iffy, but I'm really targeting the winter meeting for us all to actually see each other. And I think it was Lori who just mentioned have a cocktail together. I look forward to that. So thank you very much, everyone. Well job. Good job.
Thanks, everybody. It's a wrap. No, really, it's over this time. I promise you. You're not coming back.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And
See
thank
ya.
you all for the
Happy
work.
holidays. Safe. Have a safe one. And we'll see you in 2021. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.